Hello everyone, welcome to another video in my Apollo Moon Hoax series. In this video I'm going to be talking about the missing Apollo 11 telemetry tapes. It's a subject I've been wanting to do for quite a while. And what I'm going to do here is be referencing NASA's own investigation into this subject. Now, for those of you that do not know, the tapes contain some important information from the Apollo 11 mission. Actually, all of them, but we're going to just specifically talk about Apollo 11. So it had three pieces of important information. Number one, it had the biomedical information for the astronauts. Number two, it had the telemetry from both the command module and the lunar module. And number three, it had the visual raw footage that was sent back from the moon. That is footage regarding Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the lunar surface. Now, the way this basically worked was, according to the official version, when they landed on the moon, the signal was sent back from the moon to 3 tracking stations on Earth. Now, when the signal arrived at these tracking stations, they had to go through a conversion process because it was in a different bandwidth, and they wanted to show this live to an American audience and the rest of the world. So they had to convert it from the width band it was in to be more compatible with the width band for US television and, of course, around the world. Now, unfortunately, when they did that, there was a degradation in the quality of the film. So what the engineers originally had seen at these tracking stations were crisp, clear images of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. And by the time it was sent out, that's not what the general public had seen. So after they had did the conversion, what they did is they sent the live footage through AT&T landlines, and as well as bouncing a signal of an orbiting satellite to mission control. And then from mission control, the visual raw footage was sent out to the American audience and the rest of the world. Now, because of the conversion process, what the public ended up seeing were blurry ghost-like images. So not the best quality. And they had solved that problem with the other missions after that, according again to the official version. And for some reason with Apollo 11, they didn't have that capability, so they had to do that conversion. Now, before we go ahead here to today, I want to talk about what they did after that. And I'm going to be reading from NASA's report here. So after this was all done and the world had seen this footage, a few weeks later, the engineers boxed the 1-inch telemetry tapes wound onto 14-inch canister reels, which served no other purpose than to provide backup if the live relay failed, and shipped them to the Goddard Space Flight Center. Now, that's an important point to remember because the proponents jump on that to say, well, these are just backup tapes, so it doesn't matter if they're missing because all they were is backup, so they had no real significant value. But as we read on here, we're going to see that that's not true. Okay. Now, from the Goddard Space Flight Center, the tapes were sent to the Washington National Records Center and were never seen again after that. So now let's go forward 4 decades later to just before the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11. And we're going to be talking about 2009, which was the 40th anniversary. So several years before that, these engineers who were involved in the Apollo 11 filming and tracking, they wanted to release a better version, a better quality version of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon for the 40th anniversary. So in order to do that, they needed to find the original telemetry tapes. So they went to the Washington National Records Center to access the tapes, the visual footage, the actual original footage. And of course that made sense. That's what anybody would want to do first, is to get that original footage and then digitally convert that to have a better quality. So they went looking for the tapes to sign them out, and that didn't go according to plan. So let's just read on here. The searchers never found what they set out to uncover. Aside from a few canisters of Apollo 9 telemetry tapes still stored at the WNRC, the Apollo-era telemetry tapes no longer exist anywhere. Now, there's a couple of points in that sentence that I want to, from NASA's report here, that I want to talk about. They say they found a few canisters regarding the mission Apollo 9. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with these missions, Apollo 9 officially never left low Earth orbit. And with that, they only found a few canisters. But it's the other part of this sentence that's very significant when they say the Apollo-era telemetry tapes no longer exist anywhere. So we're no longer talking about the missing Apollo 11 telemetry tapes. And mind you, that was about 14,000 reels of telemetry tapes. These are 14-inch reels each, and 14,000 of them have disappeared. Now, the Apollo era tapes encompasses all of the Apollo missions. So we're talking about all of the Apollo missions that in low Earth orbit, as well as Apollo missions that supposedly left low Earth orbit. So now we're talking about 140,000 missing telemetry tapes. Very significant. Have not been found. Now, to read on here, however, this disappointing discovery does not mean the Herculean effort that spanned more than 8 years ended in vain. The team uncovered the best television formatted recordings of the Apollo 11 moon landing and has secured NASA funding to apply modern-day digital technology to dramatically enhance the quality of these tapes. That's another important point, because what they're really saying there is the proponents have jumped on that one as well to say, well, no, we have them. We found these tapes because we have this really good digital enhancement. But that's not true, because what they say here is that this was an enhancement of a better quality copy of the original. This has nothing to do with the original footage. That's gone. That is nowhere to be found. So it's another copy of the original footage. So don't let the proponents fool you on that one either. Okay, so let's read on here, because in the pursuit for these telemetry tapes, they got a very interesting email from an employee of the Washington National Record Center. I'm going to read again right here from NASA's report. On May 4, 2006, a WNRC employee reported her findings to LeBar by way of email. LeBar, by the way, that's Stan LeBar, one of the engineers that was involved in originally tracking Apollo 11. And he was one of the engineers years later that was trying to find these original tapes so as they could be accessed to make a better quality version for the public to see for the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11. So let me just read on here. Her quote, it says this: "This was originally quite an extensive accession in our holdings, 2,614 magnetic tape containers. But over the years, mostly in the 1970s, most of the containers were permanently withdrawn by NASA. Currently, only 2 containers remain in our possession. Besides the original SF-135, by the way, SF-135 refers to the paperwork that's necessary to sign out these tapes. When we continue on to quote, we also have the original charge cards from when the boxes were being withdrawn. Unfortunately, there's very little information on the charge cards beyond the date and the box numbers. Often, even the name of the person doing the withdrawal is not included with NASA Goddard written in its place." Very significant statement here. She says that basically all of the tapes that they have, or the ones that they had anyway, were signed out in the 1970s. And I want you to remember that point, because we're going to come back to that a little later. But the other significant point about this quote here is that she's saying that proper procedures were not followed in signing out these tapes. All that's on the sign out information sheets is NASA Goddard. There's nothing else. There's no name, as she says. And if there's no name, there's no way to track, to see who gave the order to sign these out. So that's a very significant aspect of this because a proper procedure wasn't followed. And that is disturbing in and of itself. Now, I said earlier to keep in mind that the proponents say, well, these are just backup tapes and that they really had no value because once they got the information they needed, then, it didn't matter if they disappeared. Well, first of all, you have to ask yourself, well, if that's the case, why were they stored at the Washington National Record Center in the first place? And why go through the expense of storing them? But anyway, there's another quote here that really makes a point about that, the fact that they were supposedly backup tapes. Years later, after the Apollo missions, I think it was in the early 2000s, an employee, an engineer, I think at that time, who was involved in the tracking of the original mission, had found a canister reel in his garage that apparently had been there for 36 years. Amazing that he had this tape that might have had some significance and is there for 36 years. He thought it might have Apollo information on it. So he played it back, and it turns out it had nothing of value on it. It was just chatter and simulation. But there was a very interesting quote made after that regarding that, and it goes like this. If other tapes are discovered, there may well be all sorts of possibilities for space historians and others to study data from one of the most defining moments in 20th century scientific history. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So the proponents are saying that, well, these are just backup tapes. Yeah, move on. They're gone. Who cares? It's all printed on paper, so we have all that information. How do they know that that actually came from the original telemetry tapes? Because keep in mind, NASA was running simulations of these Apollo missions in the 1960s. So the printout on paper that they're talking about, 8.5 by 11, could easily have come from Apollo mission simulations. So we don't know. But what's interesting, though, is this quote here is saying that, and I say it again, I'll just read it just one more time, there may be all sorts of possibilities for space historians and others to study data from one of the most defining moments in 20th century scientific history. How more clear can it be? This person is saying that if these tapes are actually found, it will be a treasure trove of information for historians. So that really, really throws a lot of water on the proponents' claims that they were just backup tapes. And I might add that these backup tapes, this claim that they're backup tapes was made decades later when they couldn't find them in the first place. So I don't take that seriously. Proponents are wrong again on that one. All right, so let's just read NASA's concluding remarks on this. All that can be said with any certainty is that NASA and the Goddard Space Flight Center followed all procedures in storing the Apollo telemetry tapes. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. If they followed procedure storing the tapes, they certainly didn't follow procedures in signing them out. Proper procedures were not followed. We don't have a name, and since we don't have a name, we don't have the ability to track who gave the order. So there's no information, real information as to why they were signed out in the first place. Over the ensuing years, Goddard recalled them and either reused the 1-inch tapes to meet a network shortage in the early 1980s or disposed of them because of the high cost of storing them. Really? Remember when I said keep in mind that these tapes were signed out in the 1970s? I said we'd come back to that. The proponents used this quote right here to justify the missing tapes. Now, this quote says there was a shortage of magnetic tape in the 1980s. And that's the reason why these tapes were probably signed out. Nothing's definite here. It's all speculation. But we know now that these tapes were signed out in the 1970s. The shortage didn't happen till the 1980s. Now, there were tens of thousands of tapes signed out from the Washington National Record Center in the early 1980s. There's no identification as to what these tapes had on them, none at all. But the important thing to remember is that most of these tapes regarding the Apollo missions were signed out in the 1970s. The tape shortage didn't take place Didn't happen until the 1980s. The proponents are wrong on that one as well. Okay? At no time did anyone recognize the unique content on roughly 45 tapes containing the actual moonwalk video. All right, that's just difficult to believe. How can you not label properly one of the most defining moments in 20th century scientific history? The actual 45 tapes referring to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the lunar surface. And nobody thought to label this, so nobody would make a mistake and accidentally sign these tapes out and throw them away? No, absolutely no way. And to continue on here, at no time did anyone ever consider what could be possible nearly 40 years into the future with the advent of new technology. Oh, this just gets better. Remember, we're talking about NASA. Okay, NASA. The high IQ people. They're trying to tell us that they had no foresight into the future. Oh, we didn't know that this was going to be capable. We're going to have different means of downloading information. NASA was working on digital technology back then. Now, digital technology had been used in airplanes years before, but NASA claims that they had their first integrated digital computer in both the command module and lunar module. So it's very difficult to believe that they didn't anticipate technology decades later that would be able to take this information from the missing telemetry tapes, and I say missing, and download it, just like they do with musical recordings. They have many ways of downloading that today. So that's very difficult to believe that NASA did not anticipate that. Okay, so the question is why were these tapes signed out in the first place? Well, there's only two possible reasons. The first reason is that there was nothing on these tapes. That's why they had to be signed out. If historians had gotten their hands on these tapes and realized there was nothing on them, that would have revealed the hoax. Or the other reason is that there was information on these tapes, but it was simulations. NASA was running Apollo mission simulations, so that's what was really on these tapes. Again, historians would have been able to determine that the information came from simulations. So either way, these tapes had to be destroyed, because if they weren't destroyed and historians had have gotten their hands on them, they would have realized that the whole thing was a hoax. Hoax, hoax, hoax.